In terms, so I'm going to start out by talking about a few human rights principles that we're going to use. There are many more, but I just want to be very specific about the ones we're going to use today. And so 3 of them are the obligation to respect, and you don't have to write these down, they're right here. Okay, so you don't have to write them. Do you have these, everybody? It's in your folder. So the first is the obligation to respect, and the obligation to respect requires that governments to refrain from interfering with the enjoyment of economic and social rights. To comply with the obligation on the right to housing, that enforced evictions are a violation of the obligation to respect. The obligation to protect, and we're going to actually spend a lot of time looking at the obligation to protect in terms of the economic crisis. And the obligation to protect, and these are from the Maastricht Guidelines, says that the governments have to prevent violations of human rights by third parties. So we'll talk more when we talk about the crisis as to how the government actually violated this obligation to protect, because they didn't protect from the actions of third parties, mainly the financial sector and all of those folks. And then the last is the obligation to fulfill, and this obligation is to facilitate, provide, and promote rights. And in a way, I think listening from yesterday, a lot of what we're talking about here is the obligation to fulfill, right? I mean, does the government have the obligation to fulfill the right to education for single mothers? Does the right to housing or the right to transportation? I mean, all of the discussions we've had yesterday and today focuses mostly on the obligation to fulfill. And so these are the 3 that we're using as our overarching umbrella of human rights instruments. The others are progressive realization and non-retrogression. Okay? Now, this is also, you don't have to write this down. It's in the 2nd page of all of them. Okay, so progressive realization and non-retrogression. What that says is that when you have economic and social rights, there's not an assumption that if you have a government commitment to an economic and social right, that it happens overnight, right? So let's say the right to food. Let's say we had a right to food. I mean, the problem with the U.S. is that we don't have many rights. But if we had let's say that there was a recognized right to food, it doesn't mean that within human rights that tomorrow morning everyone has got food. But what economic and social rights says is that there has to be progressive realization. That means that the state has to keep trying to get to that final outcome of the right to food, and you can't take back any place that you've gotten to, right? So if you've gone somewhere, you can't retreat from it, right? So non-retrogression and progressive realization. Now, if you look at this little book, and I'm doing this just as an example, and James and I will look much more at sort of data later on. But if you look at page 18 in this graph, in this book, the bottom graph. What page? 18. 1-8. If you look at the bottom graph, right? So this idea of progressive realization and non-retrogression, right? It sounds good. You know, you should move forward. How do we hold the government accountable? How do we judge them by it? So one of the ways we've done this in the methodology that we've come up with is in the bottom graph. We look at the U.S. in comparison to other countries, right? what does the U.S. look like in comparison to the other countries in terms of social expenditure? Social expenditure is, you know, the kind of spending on health, education, and all of these things. And we look at it in comparison to other countries, and you see the U.S. is the second from the bottom. Japan is the lowest, right? So if you look at the U.S.'s public social expenditure as a percentage of their GDP, they're actually lower than all the other European countries, right? So it's not like we have to ask the government that you have to spend a certain amount. We're saying in comparison to other countries around you, are you spending much? And we see that they're not spending much. And then the progressive realization and non-retrogression, you look at it over time, across history. How has the spending happened, right? Is it getting better? Because if they're meeting human rights obligations, the spending on social expenditure should get better, right? And it shouldn't go down. So this is one way of looking at, and you can look at this nationally, you can look at this statewide, you can look at it locally. You can actually look at the data and say, what has been the policy of the government towards progressive realization and non-retrogression? Okay, that's just one example. The other one is that the use of maximum available resources. So human rights says that the government should use the maximum available resources to make sure that economic and social rights are fulfilled. And that's a vague concept, and even within human rights it's not really clear what that means. But one of the things that we could look at is the ways in which tax policy, right? I mean, I'm in New Jersey, and I just started working in New Jersey, and I'm a state employee of New Jersey. And there's huge budget cuts, and we can talk about this later, huge budget cuts. The state university, this is a public university, it's a government university, and we're getting, I think, $13 million budget cut next week. They're cutting education, they're cutting funding for housing, they're cutting everything. The one thing they will not do is raise taxes on people who make more than $1 million. Right? They will not do that. They will not raise taxes for people over $1 million because they're all going to leave and go to Florida. Right? That's their excuse. So here is an argument, a human rights argument, that talks about the state's obligation to use the maximum available resources. Right? So during the Bush tax cuts on the wealthy, I mean, we all sort of screamed about it. But if you look at sort of tax to GDP ratio, what you see is that during those tax cuts, the amount of money that the government had plummeted, right? And so you can actually hold the government accountable in terms of not using the maximum available resources. And we'll talk about this later when we look at the fiscal and monetary policy. The third one is non-discrimination and equality. And that says that you cannot discriminate in economic and social rights. And I think in the United States, one of the important things of non-discrimination and equality is that because the U.S. hasn't signed and ratified many conventions in the UN, what we do have is CERD, right? The Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And the non-discrimination in CERD has a lot of economic and social rights in terms of non-discrimination and equality. So even though we might not have the right to housing or the right to health, we have the right to not discriminate in the right to health and the right to housing, right? So if we actually want to hold the government accountable for its actual, what they've signed and ratified, non-discrimination and equality is an important one for the United States. The other thing about non-discrimination and equality is it's an immediate right. It's not this progressively realized right, right? So all the others are progressive realized, don't go back. Non-discrimination is immediate. It's like not torture, right? It's the same as, it has the same kind of standing as some of the civil and political rights, is that non-discrimination and equality is an immediate right. So if there's any policy that we can show, the busing for the schools in terms of non-discrimination, that's an immediate right that you have to have because it's in CERT, so we can actually evoke that one.